Last week we started looking at a number of passages that have to do with this question of God permitting actions of the devil, of Satan, of demons. Like the general question maybe we would say is, why does God allow spiritual forces of evil to operate at all? And particularly, why does God allow them to attack his people? Or how is it that God can use those powers? So we started looking at those, and we're going to look at one more in the Old Testament today, and maybe two in the New Testament. We'll see how many we have time for. Of course, the first of those is Job. So we've looked at Job a few times. We're going to go a little bit more into his story today. So Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. One of the things we have to do right away in the book of Job is we can sometimes import a New Testament theological point into the book of Job that will cause us to totally miss the point of the book of Job. And what we'll do is we'll say, well, Romans 3:23 says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so Job must have actually really been a sinner, right? And that would be to miss the point of the book. The point of the book is to say that there's this man who suffers unimaginably. And the reason is not that he sinned. Okay? That has to be fundamental to the book. And in fact, we can see that God himself endorses this description of Job. Down here, verse 6, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came in among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" And he said, "I've been roaming around the earth." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Exact same statement as verse 1 made, but here God himself is making it. And so whatever happens to Job, we must not say it happened because Job sinned. That answer is just barred from us right from the very beginning of the book. And in fact, if we were to do that, we would be taking the position of Job's stupid friends, who that's their whole position throughout the whole entire book, and it never evolves. They never modify their argument at all. It's basically just, Job, you must have done something wrong. And that's the whole thing all the way through the book. And so we don't want to be in that position. God actually condemns them at the end of the book and tells them, you better ask Job to pray for you. And so we don't want to do that, okay? So Job, this is, whatever's going to happen to him is going to happen to a righteous man. Okay, one of the other things that helps us with too is sometimes people have the idea that, it's sin, maybe unrepented of sin or something, that gives demons the ground or the possibility to attack people. And that may be, in a sense, true, but it's not the whole truth, because here, God is going to permit Satan to obliterate Job's life. And it's not because Job sinned. God permits Satan to act in this way toward a righteous man. So, on a very practical level, when we ask the question, like if we see in somebody, sort of a demonic torment or oppression, we need not assume, well, that must be because that person has done something wrong, and they have opened the door wide to demonic influence. Here we have a story in the Bible where Satan attacks this man, and he hasn't opened himself wide. He hasn't done anything to welcome this. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So God extols Job's character, and then Satan is not happy with that. And so Satan incites God to allow him to destroy Job. And he does this with 2 accusations and 2 attacks. Okay? So Satan answered the Lord, and he said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." So, Satan's first attack is an attack on Job as well as on God. So, Satan accuses Job of being a bought man. Yes? But, simultaneously, what that also means is that he is accusing God of buying loyalty. So, in other words, the accusation is against Job lacking integrity, but is also against God lacking integrity. The accusation is that God is himself not truly good and worthy of worship apart from bribery. Do you see that? Which of course is one of Satan's main interests, is trying not only to disprove the goodness of humanity, but to disprove the goodness of God. And of course that's his first attack in the garden is the exact same thing. He says, did God really say you can't have any fruit from any tree in the whole entire world? And he's just questioning God's goodness there. And so, on the basis of these two accusations, Satan challenges God to allow Satan to take all of Job's earthly prosperity away, from his possessions to his servants to his family. And God allows it. So we come on down here. Behold, all that he has is in your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now there was a day when the sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. So he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And there came a messenger to Job. So imagine this is the day that you have. You wake up and like your family, your kids are feasting. It's a day of, it's Thanksgiving or something. And then, a messenger comes. And the messenger says, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans, those bandits, fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you. So maybe your most major asset has just gone up in flames. While that guy is speaking, another guy comes and gets in line behind him.
You fell asleep.
Oh, it's too powerful. Get out of here. So while that guy's speaking, another guy gets in line, and then he says, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he's speaking, there's a line forming behind the first guy. Another guy came, the Chaldeans, that is the Babylonians. They formed 3 groups, and they made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And then while he was speaking, there came yet another and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Wow. And that's the hand of the devil. So then Job arose, and he tore his robe, and he shaved his head, and fell on the ground, and he worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. Yahweh gave, and Yahweh has taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. So, the end of this first accusation and first attack, Job is expressing profound grief, and yet he still blesses the name of the Lord. And so at the end of this chapter, it's God 1, Satan 0. Yes? So then, chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves. We see the same exact thing. Where have you come from? I've been roaming around here. I consider my servant Job. There's none like him. And then this additional statement. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. That's a really troubling phrase right there. Then Satan answered the Lord. He said, skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. So the Lord said, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. So Satan went out in the presence of the Lord, and he struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. So he took a piece of broken pottery, which just scraped himself while he sat in the ashes. And you say, which ashes? Well, the ashes of his life, I would expect. You know, there's just... So then his wife, she says, you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. And he said, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? So there's a question, really, to frame the whole entire book. Shall we receive good from God and not evil? That's a really interesting question. Should we receive evil from God? Well, I thought God doesn't do evil. What is going on here? But in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. So now, Satan has attacked him again, but Job still refuses to curse God. And so at the end of chapter 2, it is God 2, Satan 0. In this wager that they've made. Which is a good thing, yes? But not if you're Job.
I don't like thinking about God making a wager.
Yeah, I know. Well, and wager's probably a crude term.
No, but I don't like him having whatever this exchange between he and Satan are.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. I'm not going to, we're going to talk about another passage later, but there's a New Testament sort of parallel for this a little bit. It is the story of Luke chapter 22, and we'll look more at it, but it's when Jesus is going to be betrayed, and he's talking to Peter, and he knows Peter's going to betray him. He knows Peter's going to deny him. And he says to Peter, in Luke 22:31, Satan has demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. So Satan, he makes some demand, and for whatever the reason, God entertains it. And that's one of the huge questions. Why, God? Why do you... Which is Job's question. You know, Job doesn't even know what's going on, sort of in the heavenly realm. He doesn't know that God has had these conversations with Satan. But Job's life is in absolute shattered pieces at the end of chapter 2. You know, there's just no way to overstate that. Before chapter 2, before the end of this, Job had 10 kids, a whole bunch of employees, a whole bunch of land and flocks and good things. And now, at the end of chapter 2, he's got no kids, no property, and his wife hates him. Like that's Job's life. And so Job wants two things then, and these two things then dominate the rest of his talk throughout the book. Job wants to talk to God. He demands an audience with God. And he wants his honor restored. That's what Job is after. He wants to know what in the world is going on. And so he doesn't charge God with wrongdoing, but he demands that God explain himself. So the story then leaves, for us, the reader, with some really troubling questions. Why did God do this or allow this? The question can be maybe broadly stated as, why does God allow suffering? Particularly, why does he allow the righteous to suffer? But it's even more specific than that, because what Job is encountering is not a neutral sort of suffering of life. Job is encountering attack by the devil who wants to destroy him. So the more specific question is not just why does God allow suffering broadly, but why does God allow Satan to attack his creation? What is going on there? So you have, from chapter 2, you have then 35 chapters of Job. So the first thing that happens is he has these three friends that come to eat from their own place: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They made an appointment together to come to show sympathy and comfort for him. which is just a good model, for the church. It would be that, sometimes when people are really struggling, there needs to be a little bit of a plan. They made an appointment. So you've got somebody who's hurting, and we need to be a little bit more intentional, maybe even in our church. We have a culture out here in Central Oregon of just like, everything just kind of happens how it happens, and there's not necessarily always a real formal structure to things. That's not quite the culture out here. Central Oregon's a bunch of cowboys. And we kind of can sometimes function like that if we're not careful. But what they do is they make an appointment. They say, we're gonna go help our friend. And so they did. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. That's how bad he looks. So they raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. And so far, they're doing great. They're doing fantastic. They are totally great until they start talking. So then after this, Job opens his mouth and he cursed the day of his birth. Job now is at a point in life where he's thinking it would have been better for me to have never been born. And so he curses the day he's born all the way down through here. I mean, gosh, look at what he says. Why was I not?
It's a hard one for me to read.
It's horrifying. But you can see, this is such a profound, the Bible's not a shallow book. It's not a simple book. It dives into the most horrific of human suffering and gives voice to it, which is a good thing. Job here, he says, why was I not as a hidden stillborn child? Oh my gosh, it's terrible.
Before we get too far into that, can I ask you a question?
Please, yeah, go back.
In this time in history, amongst God's people, were they knowledgeable of Satan and who he was as we are today?
So are you talking about in the time of Job, or in the time of the people who maybe wrote the book of Job?
In the time of Job.
I'm not sure.
I know it's
some of the issues.
First book, almost book.
Yeah, well, right. And so part of the issue is we don't even know who Job exactly was. We don't even know where he lived. Like he presumably was not an Israelite. There's no sense. So Job's a super interesting book in that regard because there's no indication that he's an Israelite. He doesn't have an Israelite name. He's not associated with an Israelite area. But the covenant, the Israel covenant name of God, Yahweh, is all over the book. So you're like, well, how is that? So to answer the question, like, what does Job know about the inhabitants of the spiritual realm? I have no idea. Well, I'll say, actually, we'll get into, I think that's some of the point of what's going on here. Job doesn't know very much. No matter what he knows, he doesn't know very much, and that's one of the things that God will say to him. So Job is so just in bad shape. And then his friends start speaking, and it's just bad. So we're not going to go through the whole book of Job, but so Job's speeches throughout the book will change. He is dynamic in the sense that he really is actively wrestling with what has happened with him, and he's grasping at different ideas of what in the world might be going on. He's demanding justice from God. He's demanding an answer from God. It's like Job is like a real person in the book. By contrast, his friends are not like real people. Meaning, there's a term that youngsters use this term, an NPC. It's a gamer term. It refers to a non-player character. When people play a video game, they go and they'll talk to video game characters, but those characters are not real characters. They're not real people, right? They're scripts. Like, they just have scripts. So they'll go talk to them, but they only say the same things over and over and over again, right? It's a whole scripted conversation. They're not a real, versus the player, that's a human, a person. That's probably not an analogy that makes too much sense, but the point is, Job is like a real person in the book. His friends, their perspective never changes at all. It's the same script over and over and over and over again. In slightly different verbiage, but their basic idea is, Job, you've done something wrong, and you need to repent. That's the whole thing. And Job knows, as the reader knows, he has not done anything wrong and he doesn't need to repent. That's not what's going on in here. Job knows that, the reader knows that, his dumb friends don't know that. So that whole thing goes for 35 chapters. The last guy that speaks is this guy, Elihu. Now he's not one of Job's friends. He's a young guy. Let's see, go back up. Where does he started? 33. Oh, 32. So Elihu, he gets up, and he is the son of Barachel the Buzite, whoever that is. He's this younger guy, and he's been listening to this whole conversation throughout the whole entire book, and then he gets really upset because he looks at Job's friends and he thinks, you guys are doing a terrible job of comforting a friend. Because the only thing that changes with them is they get increasingly hostile to Job. They don't like his obstinance in maintaining his own innocence. And so he eventually gets to the point where he's ready to speak. And the contribution that he basically makes to Job is, maybe it's not that God is punishing you for sin. Maybe it's that he's keeping you humble. He is putting your life into the pit temporarily so that you will be sure to remember how dependent you are on God and how much you need him. And that's kind of his basic idea. And you think, well, that's not a terrible thought generally. But again, if you're Job, did God have to do that to just tell Job, hey, remember that you're not all that and you still need me? Does that make sense? It's still, he gives a more satisfactory answer than the friends of Job, but still, you're looking at it and that doesn't totally suffice. And so it's really not until God speaks that we get any kind of real resolution. So, Job, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And this is one of those places we tend to read the dialogue of God according to however we sort of tend to think. So be careful with that. That's my point. Because I don't know how God said this to Job. I don't think that God actually said this harshly to Job. We read it harshly, I think, because we are harsh. And we've read 37 chapters of Job. We're kind of tired of Job too, if we're honest about it. Yeah, right. But then if you actually go back and you think about it, you're like, no. Yeah, it's just he has no idea how to make sense of his life. Okay, so who is this that's darkening counsel by words without knowledge? Dress fraction. I'll question you, you make it known to me. So then God gives him several chapters of, he answers Job. He finally grants Job's first request to talk to him. And this is a huge, huge deal. He answers Job in four main ways. We're not going to go real in depth through these four things. But the first thing is that the first answer that God gives Job is that Job cannot manage the physical cosmos. That's his first sort of gentle rebuke. And it's this language like this kind of stuff. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, Job? Do you understand? And of course, the rhetorical answer is no, Job doesn't understand. He doesn't understand the measurements, the bases, the cornerstone. Who shut in the sea with doors, the clouds, day and night, seasons. It's cosmic things. The depths of the sea. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Where is the place of darkness? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail? All this kind of stuff. It's the managing of the physical cosmos, yes? Mm-hmm. And the basic point of all of that, this is all the way through verse 38 of chapter 38, is that, Job, you cannot even manage the physical cosmos. I.e., there's more going on in this vast cosmos than we can possibly understand. So this is not God. I don't think God's being harsh with Job. I think he's belaboring a point of, Job, there's such vastness to all that there is that the answer that you're looking for is something that you don't have the capacity to even grasp. Because Job is so small, and God is showing this to Job without saying it in a harsh way. The harsh way to be, Job, you are so small and insignificant and inconsequential. You have no idea what's going on here. God could say it like that. He doesn't say it like that. He says, Job, let me ask you some questions about the world that you think you live in. About the rain, the snow, the lightning, and the stars, and the constellations, and the sun, and the moon, and the depths of the sea, and the foundations of the earth. I want to ask you some questions about that. And the idea there is that, first lesson to Job, the first answer, is that there's a vast amount more going on in the cosmos than Job can understand. And nonetheless, that Almighty God cares for Job. So in other words, he leads him through this sort of tour of the cosmos, the stars and the vastness of the world. And Job then can see in that he's very small, very small. But for Job, his concerns have been all-encompassing. They have loomed very large. Now he sees he's very small. But also he sees that Almighty Yahweh God is speaking to him. Do you see the contrast there? The next main thing that God then turns, and he starts talking about animals. Okay? So, many, many, many animals. And the basic idea of the second section is, Job, you cannot provide for the simple creatures of earth. Okay? That's the idea there. You can't hunt the prey for the lion. You can't satisfy the appetite of the young lions. You can't provide the raven its prey. You don't know when the mountain goats give birth. So it's this whole section speaking about all these animals and asking the same thing, not coming right out and saying, Job, you're so impotent. You can't accomplish anything, not even feeding the earthly little small creatures that populate your local neighborhood. Like, he's not doing that. He's just leading Job on a tour of kind of the animal kingdom to make a point. And the point is that, Job, you can't even provide for the well-being, really, of the simple creatures of earth. Let alone, you can't guarantee good for complex creatures like humans. Or you might say it like this. If I were to ask you, well, if I were to just give you a hippopotamus and say, I hope you take good care of it.
Please don't.
And you don't have the internet and you don't have a library. Do you have any idea what that animal needs? That's what God is saying to Job. Like, you don't understand what is good. Not even for these very simple creatures. Okay? You don't understand what the raven needs, what the donkey needs, what the lion needs. You don't understand what he's good. So again, on another level, he's revealing to Job, I think gently, Job's ignorance, because Job thinks that God maybe has done him wrong. He thinks that, he wonders why God has allowed such evil to happen, at the very least that. And God is gently challenging Job to really reflect on, do you even know what is good for human thriving? Like, you don't know what's good for animal thriving. How much more do you think you know? Okay? So, he goes down that level. The third, and it's just really, it's a very sweet, I think it's very sweet. God, because, okay, a little side note here. Look how much God knows about animals. Isn't that sweet? Like, God knows everything about these animals. It's just really a very sweet thing.
So even though God allowed Satan to do all these horrible things, he is taking quite a bit of time
To answer Job?
to answer.
To talk to him, yes.
Which was probably the whole point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
So, now, God answers, he kind of caps these first two sections here, and he says, so, is there any fault finder who wants to contend with the Almighty? Meaning, Job, do you find fault He who argues with God, let him answer it. And we get Job's first answer. And Job says, I am of small account. Okay, so he's gotten the point. That was the point that God made. He led him through a tour of the cosmos to make that exact point. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. So Job is sort of done, but God is not done. So, and then he answered him out of the whirlwind, and he said, same thing. And now he's saying to Job, are you as powerful as God, as wise and just? And specifically, he goes for this moral idea of justice here. And he challenges Job. He says, adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low. Tread down the wicked where they stand. So what does he do? He's challenging Job. Job, if you want to think, if you want to question me doing justice, how about you do it? How about you have my job? Can you grant justice to everyone who deserves it? Can you tread down the wicked, hide them all in the dust together, bind their faces in the world below? And then look what God says. If you can do all that, then will I also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. So, here then, God is gently again revealing to Job, Job has never been the person who can provide for his own security, well-being, and salvation. Job, in fact, cannot save himself. And that's seen in the fact that Job can't do justice to everybody. Okay. Then we get two very odd descriptions. We get the whole behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. And then we get this description of behemoth, and then we get a description for the entirety of chapter 41 of Leviathan. Okay? So, what in the world is going on here? The strength in his loins, his power in the muscles of his belly, he makes his tail stiff like a cedar, the sinews of his thighs are knit together, his bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs are bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God, let him who made him bring near his sword. For the mountains yield food for him, where all the wild beasts play, where the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds in the marsh. So you've got this behemoth. And the question down at the bottom is, can a person take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with a snare? Like the idea is, can you get this creature under control? And the answer is no, he cannot. And then he says, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook? Or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you or take him for your servant? To take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as a bird? Will you put him on a leash for your girls? It's like, God, that's a low blow because all his girls are dead. But will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? So, gosh, you go way on down the line here. Now, what in the world are these creatures?
Dinosaurs.
So some people think dinosaurs. So we could break this into two possibilities. One would be some type of literal interpretation, and the idea that God is speaking about, and only about, actual flesh and blood animals. The behemoth, that is not an English word, that is a Hebrew word, that is a transliteration of Hebrew, behemoth. Which is a plural form of just the word for beast. So behemoth just means like great beast. Psalm 104 mentions this. Verse 24. Leviathan, not the behemoth, Leviathan, sorry. So Leviathan in Psalm 104 seems to be just a creature of the sea. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which he formed to play in. So some people interpret these passages in Job as kind of poetic descriptions of actual animals. The usual contenders would be, some people would say dinosaurs, some people would say hippopotamus or an elephant or behemoth. Usually people would say something like crocodile for Leviathan. I don't think that's exactly what's going on here. One is that the behemoth, there's no, where does he, let's see here. If we go to Job 40 for 15, he makes his tail stiff like a cedar. That is a description that really would not fit for a hippopotamus or an elephant. They do not have stiff tails.
Brontosaurus.
Maybe a brontosaurus, yes. Yeah.
The whole description fits brontosaurus.
Yeah, so, it could be. The more troubling one is actually the Leviathan. Because you've got things about Leviathan that really seem to be sort of a standard, like, mythological dragon. Specifically, I could tell you, his sneezings, Job 41:18, his sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. And so that really gets troubling. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke as from a boiling pot, and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. So that's hard to see that in any physiological animal, any kind of earthly reptile. So what in the world is going on here? Well, the other option would be that these creatures are descriptions that are in some ways reference of actual creatures, but exalted to symbolically represent something else. So the Bible will do this oftentimes with animals. Like it'll use animals as a symbol for something else. So if you can think of Daniel chapter 7, for example, Daniel, there's a dream of that Daniel's interpreting, and the dream is of these different beasts that come up out of the sea, and there's a bear and there's a panther, and these animals though are representative of human kingdoms. Does that make sense? So you can see animals in some places in the Bible representative, symbolic of something else. You can also see throughout the prophets, and this is really for a long, long history in Judaism, the association of certain animals with demonic powers. Particularly more so like wilderness animals, like you'll see things like God will bring judgment on a city or nation or empire, and then the language used it'll become a haunt of jackals, a place where the ostrich lives, or a place where and it'll reference these different kind of birds. And you'll see other literature in Judaism that correlates those animals with basically demonic spirits, where the animal is a symbol of dark spirits. There does seem to be some kind of symbolism going on here, because in Job, there's a moral quality given to these creatures. Specifically Leviathan, we see at the end, chapter 41 and verse 34, Leviathan is described as he sees everything that is high, and he is king over all the sons of pride. And that's a weird description. That might just be meaning he's very large and happy to be that size. But the other thing that's interesting is if you go back to chapter 40, and God talking about whether or not Job is capable of handing out justice to everyone to whom it is due, right? That section goes right into the description of Behemoth and the question of whether or not Job can pierce his nose with a snare. And then it goes right into a description of Leviathan and whether or not anyone can draw him out with a fish hook, catch him. And the idea for Job would be, even if you could catch him, what would you do with him? Would you like try to sell him to a merchant? Would you try to make him into a pet? Like, what could you even do if you caught this creature? So I think there's a symbol here of like these two extraordinarily potent representations of powers that are to be dealt with by God that Job cannot deal with. So Leviathan, for example, we can see. So you asked a question about what awareness people would have had of, Satan or spiritual beings in Job's day. I don't know about necessarily in Job's day. You can see over the course of the development of the Hebrew Bible a sort of developing awareness of what's going on. So Leviathan, for example, in Psalm 104, you might see that Leviathan is some kind of mighty sea creature, maybe a whale or something like that. If you go to other passages like Isaiah chapter 27, for example, in that day, Yahweh, with his hard and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. So here, this is not just a creature. This is some kind of malevolent power that God is going to kill. Does that make sense? So what you might do with this is you can see in Job a description of creatures that are pointing toward sort of mythological representations, symbols of malevolent powers. So Leviathan, for example, and we think that Job lived nearby Babylon because his servant comes and tells him the Babylonians came and killed your right? One of the interesting connections here would be that in the Babylonian mythology, the Leviathan was this sort of cosmic, multi-headed dragon that, in their estimation, that their god Marduk did battle with at the beginning of time and killed that dragon, and then from that dragon's corpse made the earth. And that's not what the Bible thinks happened, but it could be drawing on that imagery and symbolism to say that dragon is in fact a created being by God. It is still malevolent. It's the serpent of Genesis chapter 3, the dragon of Revelation chapter 12. But it's like the Leviathan is perhaps even a stand-in for Satan. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what Job would have understood, but I do think if we see it this more symbolic way, then the culmination of what God is answering Job ends with God telling Job that yes, there are these powerful forces of chaos and evil that Job is being attacked by. We live in a chaotic cosmos in which we are caught at the mercy of forces that we cannot contend with. And I think maybe that is the point here. That he's telling Job that these powerful forces of evil and chaos, Job cannot understand them or contend with them. That seems to be the point of the actual description. You can't contend with behemoth. You can't contend with Leviathan. You can't catch them. You can't tame them. You can't kill them. You can't fight them. You can't do any of that. But there are nonetheless still creatures that God has made. They are creatures that God has leashed. And one day God will deal with them. So I don't know. These are odd creatures. The lesson, I think, though, would be that God is again gently telling Job that he is up against forces and powers that he cannot contend with, but God can. So, end of the day, that's Job. A whole lot more we could say about Job, and we'll pause and see if there's anything you want to talk about with him. But the crucial lessons I think that we can get from Job is Well, number one, Job cannot save anyone. Neither can we, but God can. That's what God says to him. If you can handle all this justice, then I'll acknowledge that your own right hand can save you. Job also cannot understand the problem of evil and suffering, but God does. And Job doesn't need to. So in the end, it's a quite profound book, and we don't ever arrive at a real precise, exact answer. Why did God allow Satan to attack Job? And I think that's probably the point of the book. The point of the book is we take that to God, and God, we don't know what possibly could be going on here. And then God says, yep.
You have to fight.
Oh, that's up to us.
And then though, he speaks to us, and we are comforted in knowing that God understands what's going on. And he understands these powers that we contend with. And he is dealing with them. The last thing is that what Job does recognize at the end, Job answered the Lord and he said, I know that you can do all things. This is Job's big takeaway from the whole book. You can do anything. And no purpose of yours can be thwarted. So that's a really profound statement from Job, when the whole time he's been asking, God, what are you doing? What are your purposes? So he's been wondering through the whole entire book, is there a purpose? And by the end of the book, he doesn't know what it is, but he knows that God has purpose. And that whatever his good purposes are, they cannot be thwarted. And that's contrasted with what we saw about in the first two chapters of the book. Satan, he attacks Job, and we're told, for no reason. So the contrast then, and this is a really profound point of the book, by the end of the book you see a difference between God and Satan. God has purpose, and Satan does not. God allows Satan to attack Job for purposes, and we don't know what they are because we're not God, but it's not for no reason. By contrast, Satan attacks Job for no other reason than to attack Job. Does that make sense? So you walk away from this very difficult book.
Yes and no.
Okay. Yeah, so in other words, God doesn't just smite you for the sake of smiting you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was being.
No, I understand. I get what you're saying. But Satan does. So Satan attacks you for no reason other than to hurt you. Okay, so there's Job. That's the longer section we wanted to wrestle with today, so we can get two quicker things here if we've got a couple minutes. So I mentioned Luke 22. Jesus says to Peter, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. When you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Peter said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. And Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times. 3 times that you know me. So very similar to Job, in the sense that Satan has made a demand, presumably of God, and that demand has been granted. And the demand is to have Peter in order to sift him like wheat. Now, there's a lot of debate on what does that mean, to sift him like wheat. I think it just recalls Jesus' own teaching. If you can remember, he taught a parable about the wheat and the weeds. And in that parable, he said that what will happen at the end of the age is that those things will be sorted, right? So you'd sift out the chaff and keep the wheat. And so I think that's probably what Jesus is talking about. He's saying that Satan is wanting to attack Peter to try to claim him as a weed. Does that make sense? And his attack, that sifting, is aimed at Peter's faith. But Jesus is praying that his faith will not fail. So I think the form this takes is that Satan is going to provoke Peter's fear. And Peter's then going to deny Jesus 3 times. And then Satan is going to whisper in Peter's ear, see, you don't even love him. And he's going to try to convince Peter that he is not wheat. So this is one of the main tactics of the devil, accusation.
But why would God allow that?
Well, here we can see a little bit of a clearer purpose. The New Testament gives us a little bit greater clarity. So Jesus says, I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. So Jesus sees a purpose in it. And the purpose of this sifting is that Peter's faith would be strengthened, and that would in turn give him the ability to strengthen the other disciples. So that's why he does that. So this attack strengthens Peter's faith. So that's a troubling thing. Maybe sometimes God allows spiritual attack for the purpose of, out the other end of it, strengthening a believer. That seems to be what's happening to Peter, right? And Peter says he's ready to die for Jesus. Of course, there is truth in that. If we look at John chapter 18, verse 10. Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's ear. He is ready to go to war. So when he says, I'm ready to die, he's not lying. And even when Peter denies Jesus, he only does that because he is nearby so that he can keep tabs on the trial of Jesus. Does that make sense? So even his denial. So then why does Peter deny knowing Jesus those 3 times? And I would suspect that you would just say, well, in the moment, he's afraid. And his fear gets the better of him. And in Luke 22. However, Peter's faith does not fail. It does not fail. Even when he denies Jesus. That's a very encouraging word for us. And why do I say it doesn't fail? Well, because that's what Jesus prayed. So unless we're prepared to think that the prayer of Jesus failed, no, I don't think that it did.
Well, he already tells him, when you turn again,
Right.
so he knows that he
Yep.
will.
And so for Peter, you can see it in the overall trajectory of his faith. He denies Jesus. He immediately bitterly weeps. Jesus is killed. He goes back to the Sea of Galilee to wait for Jesus. And then when he sees Jesus, he jumps out of the boat and darn near drowns because he so desperately wants to be with Jesus. So there we see Satan is permitted to attack him. The devil himself permitted to attack Peter, but Jesus sees a purpose in it, that will strengthen Peter, and it will give him a greater ministry to everybody. Okay?
I think down in chapter 21 in John also, when Jesus is returned, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of God, do you truly love me? You know that I do, Lord. Feed my lambs 3 times.
Yeah.
In my opinion, coinciding with the 3 times that
Oh, sure.
Peter denied.
Yeah.
So he put him on the spot 3
Yeah.
times.
Well, and then the other thing about, sort of, again, on the spiritual warfare level, even this conflict that's happening, Satan is after Peter, but Jesus is still behind him. Like he's praying for it. So, I mean, literally Jesus is interceding for Peter. And that's not without effect. And then, yes, he reinstates him. So over the whole course of it, it does work to Peter's ultimate benefit. Okay, one more real quickly here, because it's another short little thing like that. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And this is a place, so Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians, he is contending with these so-called super apostles. People who, I would imagine like the first century's version of like celebrity pastors. They look awesome, you know, they're really, really cool guys, and they're super apostles. They make much of themselves, and they have attempted to lure the Corinthian church away from Paul's apostolic ministry. By the way, so one of the things that we'll see over and over in the New Testament is like, this is spiritual warfare, this is serpent stuff. It's serpent stuff. Like, look at me, look at me, look at me, look at how impressive I am. Like, that's Genesis 3 stuff. You know, don't let me tell you, you figure it out. You decide for yourself what the tree is all about. And it's especially serpent stuff when it has this spiritual veneer over it. Right? So these people that are like, they use the spiritual as a cover for their own, I don't know, narcissism. It's the humble brag, you know? And once you see this, you really can't unsee it, I think. I see this all the time with our actual celebrities.
All the time.
This, like, celebrities get up and they're doing an interview, and they just do this humble brag thing. Usually it'll be by saying like, oh man, like I was with this other guy and he's just so impressive, you know. But sprinkled throughout the thing is this idea that I kind of kept up with that part. Like, it's so gross, and you can't unsee it. So anyway, Paul's contending with these super apostles, and he rebukes the church's attraction to these leaders. They boast of themselves, and so Paul will then say, he says, boasting is of no value. If we go back to chapter 10, it is not the one who boasts of himself who is approved, not the one who commends himself, but the one whom the Lord commends. It really doesn't matter what you say of yourself or what other people say of you. It really matters what God says of you. And what Paul's saying is, it's not the person who commend it. Oh, he says, what I really want is the commendation of the Lord, not even of my own conscience, not of other people, but of God. And that's what Paul's saying is important. So, but then in chapter 11, what he does is he says, but if you want to play this stupid boasting game, let's play it. Okay? So he then goes on to try to show them the foolishness of this boasting thing for really about a chapter and a half here. And so he speaks of all of his sufferings. He speaks of his Jewish heritage. I mean, look at him. He says, whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. This little aside, he says. But let's just do it. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. And then again, a little parenthetical, like, this is madness. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, countless beatings, often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews of 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times shipwrecked. Oh my gosh, danger, 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 all the time. And then, apart from all these other things, there's the daily pressure on me and my anxiety for all the churches. So, all right, he does all this boasting, then he continues. I must go on boasting, chapter 12, and here we get to our relevant passage. Though there's nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations. I know a man, wink, wink, in Christ, who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast, But not on my own behalf I will boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, because I'd be telling the truth. What's he saying then? It was me! I was that guy caught up to the third heaven, and I heard things that I can't even describe, that human language cannot capture. And then verse 7. So, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, there's the purpose statement. So this time we are given the flat, clear, there is a purpose. And the purpose is to keep Paul from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations. A thorn was given me in the flesh. A messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. So twice Paul says, this is to keep him from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so the power of Christ may rest on me. So, what's this? What was Paul's thorn? Some people say that it was like a physical thing. So Paul is described in certain early church documents, his physical stature was described. And apparently, I don't know if this is true or not, but apparently Paul was not an eminently attractive man. Paul was really kind of, not deformed, but had a goofy posture, bowed legs. The early church described him as just like physical disabilities. He speaks in one place, in Galatians, he talks about, he says, see with what large letters I write to you, and that gives some people the idea they had poor eyesight, and that might have been the thorn in his flesh. I don't think that that's probably the case. I don't think that for 2 reasons. One is when you hear Paul describe all of his suffering in chapter 11, right? The beatings, the floggings, the shipwrecks, the night and the day adrift at sea, imprisonments, danger everywhere, on and on and on. To think then that this thorn is above all that and worse than all that, such that Paul begs God to take it from him, I can't see it being I was fine with the beatings, but my eyesight? You know what I mean? And plus, his eyesight would have been something that he dealt with all of his life, and I don't think that'd be something that he could say that was a thorn given to him because of the surpassing greatness of these revelations. It seems to be something that came to him more acutely and not so chronically. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I just think it's got to be something worse than all that. Some people think it's maybe a mental health issue in the sense of anxiety, depression, worry. Again, though, the problem with that is that Paul describes that. He says, on top of all this other stuff I've dealt with, the daily anxiety that I bear for all of the churches. He describes his anxiety and doesn't seem to have the kind of, again, that doesn't seem like what he's describing as something he's begging God to take away. And so what we're left with is, it could just be a spiritual attack, like an actual messenger of the devil who harasses Paul. How did that occur? I don't know. In my imagination, I would think that this would be like a demonic spirit that whispers to Paul, that seeks to trouble his conscience. I'll paint a hypothetical here. This is not in the Bible. I'm not saying that this is biblical, but it just is kind of in my imagination. It makes sense. So we know that Paul was the persecutor of the church. We know that he conceived of himself as the worst of all sinners. And we know from Acts chapter 9, when Acts chapter 9 verse 26, when Paul went to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they are all afraid of him, and they did not believe that he was a disciple. And we can read right past that real quick, but I would think, yeah, so at the beginning at least, it was kind of difficult for Paul to get traction in the church on a very pragmatic, real level. So I could totally see this being a spiritual attack of essentially, again, accusation and deception meant to raise troubling thoughts to Paul about his past sins, his opposition to Jesus, his opposition to the church, the reluctancy with which people welcomed him into the church. And I think that I probably could see Paul being uniquely susceptible to this line of attack. Specifically, the idea maybe this demonic spirit whispering to Paul, you're not really part of the church. None of these people want you around. None of these people believe you. No one accepts you. You don't belong. You are actually the worst of sinners. And so down that kind of path. And I could think that if a messenger of Satan is allowed to just whisper in Paul's ear all the time about how not good enough he is, that's just my speculation. I don't know. End of the day, I don't know what the nature of the attack exactly was, and I think that there's a benefit to us in that because it prevents us from, it allows us to resonate with what Paul is saying,
Yes.
because we don't know what the thorn was, and so whatever thorn we feel like we might have, we can understand what Paul is feeling and come to the same conclusion that he came to, that the grace of God is sufficient for us in Christ and his power is made perfect in our weakness. So, but the point is that God permits this spiritual attack on Paul. Why? Paul sees it to prevent him from becoming conceited, to show him the sufficiency of the grace of God in Christ, and to show him a demonstration of the Spirit's power in the midst of human weakness. Okay, so that's good, right?
Yeah.
So, any thoughts on Paul there? 2 Corinthians 12. Okay, so there's all the passages that I had wanted to walk through that all have roughly to do with God directly seeming to permit powers of evil to do various things, right? We had the spirit to torment Saul. We had the Ahab and the lying prophets, the spirit that made all the prophets lie about Ahab's battle prospects. We had Job, we had Peter, and now we have Paul. All of these passages, Satan is allowed to act, but only in a manner limited according to God's permission. And everything we can see in all these stories, what ends up happening in all of them is that God's good purposes are still come about. So everything that the devil does, everything that God permits him to do, only ever comes back around to contributing to God's good purposes, even if we don't always understand what those are right now. Okay?
And God knows what the devil's going to do.
Yeah, oh yeah. Nothing the devil does surprises God. Okay? So next week we'll get into the gospel passages and demon exorcisms and Jesus interacting with demons. It'll be quite a ride. So there we go. That's it for today.